All right, so in this video, we're going to talk about the eventual collapse of the Ming Dynasty. So we're going to start with the collapse of the Ming Dynasty. So in our last video, we talked about the end of Zheng He's voyages marking a pivot point in Chinese history. Because it was around this time that the Ming emperors decided to turn inward rather than outward. So, to put this another way, the Ming emperors are going to emphasize stability rather than innovation that often comes from cultural interaction. So they're going to focus on China rather than relations with the outside world. So we kind of see China begin to isolate itself. And control access to or from the outside. So one of the things that starts to happen is that we see a big increase in smuggling and the black market. People want foreign things. But the government says trading in those things is illegal. So we get a lot of smuggling. This kind of starts to coincide with the arrival of the Europeans in the Pacific Ocean. So this is kind of around the mid-1500s, right around the time where the Portuguese and the Spanish and now the Dutch are starting to make inroads into the Pacific Ocean. The Chinese call these smugglers Japanese pirates who were very dangerous. When in fact they were simply Chinese merchants, but the Chinese government wouldn't admit that Chinese people weren't following their rules. So they weren't Japanese, they were Chinese. But the Chinese refused to admit that they were Chinese. And so a convenient story was that they were Japanese pirates. When they weren't, they were just Chinese merchants buying and selling stuff that the Chinese people wanted. Also, around this time, the Chinese emperors stop actually ruling, and they start living lives of luxury inside their palace. So they're not really even involved in the government anymore. They stop doing that stuff. And what ends up happening is that China is actually ruled by the eunuchs, and the emperor has become a figurehead. He doesn't really do anything anymore. It's really the eunuchs who are running things. All of this might have been enough had it not been for a really bad mistake by the Chinese government. Around the 1600s, the Ming government started accepting only silver as tax money. Now, by itself, that might not have been that big of a deal. Before this, people could pay their taxes in kind. And what that means is that they could pay their taxes with what they produce. So they could pay their taxes with food. They could pay their taxes in silk. They could pay their taxes in whatever it is they make, but they could pay their taxes with what they produce. Now, they have to sell their stuff for silver to give to the government, to give their taxes. Remember that they're not really interacting with the Europeans, but because the Spanish have flooded the global economy with silver, the value of silver drops. It's not worth as much as it used to be worth because there's a lot more silver out there. And the Chinese government is happy to sell stuff to the Spanish for their silver. So all the Chinese are doing right now is this is all making the value of silver drop even more. Because not only are the Spanish flooding the market with silver, the Chinese government is flooding the Chinese economy with silver. So the people who have to now buy silver with their stuff, people are getting less and less silver for their products, but the tax rates remain high, which means that you have to sell more and more stuff to get the necessary silver. All of this is a very long way of saying that this served to make the people angry. And the first rule of any government is to keep your people happy. And what the Chinese government is doing here, and all of this other stuff, made the people angry. So they're going to start rebelling. They don't have as much food to eat because they're having to sell their food to make the money for the taxes. They can't get the stuff they want because China has decided to cut themselves off from the rest of the world. The Chinese emperors are not actively ruling, and it's the eunuchs who are ruling now. So the people are going to start rebelling. Quick side note before we actually topple the Ming Dynasty. Because the Spanish are now so involved in the Chinese economy, the Spanish need an outpost near China. And so they take over the Philippine Islands. And the reason they're called the Philippine Islands is they're named after the king of Spain, who was Philip. So they're called the Philippines because they're named after the king of Spain. Anyway, back to the story. The people start rebelling. So we get a big rebellion. The Chinese people rebel. They're joined by invading groups. So groups from around China start invading at the same time. And these groups are all aided by the Mandarins. The Mandarins hate the eunuchs for taking over the government. They're all supposed to be on the same side, and the Mandarins hate the eunuchs because they've grown more powerful. They're not supposed to be as powerful as they are. The mandarins and the eunuchs are supposed to be equal, and the mandarins are angry that the eunuchs have taken over the government. So there's a big rebellion, and the Ming Dynasty collapses under all of these rebellions in 1644. And this brings us to our last dynasty, the last Chinese dynasty, the Qing Dynasty. So the Qing Dynasty is going to last for a long time, 1644 all the way up to 1911. So the Qing Dynasty is going to be with us through the rest of time period 4, all of time period 5, and right up to the beginning of time period 6. Now, the Qing Dynasty is another foreign dynasty. So the Qing Dynasty was a foreign dynasty, like the Yuan Dynasty. In fact, the people that the Qing Dynasty represented are called Manchurians, from Manchuria. Now, today, Manchuria is the northeastern part of China. Back then, Manchuria, so now it's the northeast part of China. Then it was just the neighbor of Mongolia. So the Manchurians and the Mongolians are actually pretty similar people. And the Qing Dynasty is going to look very similar to the Yuan Dynasty. So there is a prohibition on intermarriage. So Chinese people could not marry a Manchurian. They also could not learn the Manchurian language. They also forced the Chinese, or Chinese men, to grow what was called a queue, which, if you've ever seen movies about China during this period, it's a long braided ponytail. So you would shave your head except for the crown of your head, and you'd let that hair grow very long, and you'd braid it into a ponytail. This was a Manchurian style, and everyone had to do this. But unlike the Yuan Dynasty, the Manchurians respected Chinese culture and adopted a lot of it. Most importantly was probably the continuation of the Confucian education system and bureaucracy. So all of that stayed. The Manchurians knew that that worked well, so they kept it around. They liked Confucianism. They liked what Confucianism brought. They liked the stability. And so the Qing Dynasty kept that stuff going, which meant that the Chinese liked the Qing, liked the Manchurians, a lot more than they liked the Mongolians. So at first, the Qing emperors were dynamic leaders. So the first few Qing emperors were very good leaders. They were intellectual, and they kind of renewed Chinese dominance in the area. Two in particular that we'll name here. Kongxi, the Kongxi emperor, 1661 to 1722, and Qianlong, 1736 to 1795. Both of these guys were Confucian scholars. They wrote poetry. They were big art patrons. So Chinese culture blossoms again. And we'll talk more about that in our next video. On top of that, they reopened the Chinese economy. And oversaw a military expansion, kind of for the first time since maybe the Tang Dynasty. So China grows again and reasserts itself in areas that used to be controlled by China. So places like Vietnam, Nepal, Tibet. These are places in Central Asia. So Vietnam, but Nepal and Tibet are both in Central Asia. However, towards the end of Qianlong's reign, the old habits came back, and so his health declined, and the eunuchs took over again. And that kind of set a precedent for later Qing emperors. But we're going to stop with the story there. So at this point, the Qing Dynasty is strong, dynamic, but again, it looks like things are going to go the same way that it did with the Ming Dynasty. So in our next video, we're going to look at the social and economic and cultural side of both the Ming and the Qing dynasties. So until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.